media artist and independent curator. He co-founded the annual Small Press and Activist Festival DIY Cultures. It's been running since 2013. In 2008, he set up the Other Ages Collective. Hamja was shortlisted for a Liberty Human Rights Award for the Free Tala Ahsan campaign, which you may have encountered over the past 24 hours or so in various forms, on Tala's extradition from US-UK extradition. His book, Shy Radicals, The Anti-Systemic Politics of the Introvert Militant, is due out in early 2016 from Bookworks. He's currently a research consultant on the project Race and Citizenship in the Context of the War on Terror, led by Dr. Nisha Kapoor at the University of York. We will then hear from Aimee Lee, who is co-author with Fiona Shamus of Feral Citizens and a founding organiser of Occupy Dartmouth. She was listed as one of Muzzle's 30 writers on the 30 and has shared a stage with Questlove and Black Thought of the Roots. She's a PhD student in practice-based research at Royal Holloway. And then, finally we'll hear from Srishti From Srishti Krishnamoorthy, who's a third-year doctoral student in English at the University of Cambridge. She works on the botanical poetics and sexual politics of contemporary experimental poetry by women, and has research interests in gender and sexuality, including feminism, queer theory, body studies, and psychoanalysis, eco-poetics, and postcolonialism. Right, so we're going to have 3 presentations, hopefully around 10 minutes, and then we'll have a discussion. Oh, and you should have a handout against this presentation that is circulating now.
Anybody need one? Okay.
So just by a random show of hands, how many of people here have heard of or are familiar with the Free Tala Ahsan campaign? Okay, so just a minority. So I'll just give some background and context to sort of what I'm going to speak about and where my interest in poetry comes from. So my interest in poetry rekindled it comes entirely from prison conversations with my brother, who was one of the people detained without trial in Britain under the US Extradition Treaty. So just some basic facts. So my brother was ripped from his family home in Tooting, South London, in 19th of July 2006, and that was from an extradition request from the US government. No one in our house, including myself and my parents, had actually been to the US or set foot there, and so Tala had this indictment over him from the state of Connecticut, and was detained without trial, charge, or prima facie evidence for over 6.5 years. And to put that into context, that is longer than anyone under Northern Ireland's internment. And his co-defendant, someone called Baba Ahmed, he was probably the most high-profile Muslim domestic prisoner, and he was detained without trial for over 8 years. And in the British system, you have 50% on parole, so they're held the equivalent of 16-year and 12-year sentences without trial, charge, or prima facie evidence. And this was done at the request of the sort of 2003 US-UK Extradition Treaty, which was one of those things under the sort of war and terror, when Blair and Bush were best friends. So as we have this declaration of infinite war, which is the war and terror in time and space, we also alter ourselves. So many of the basic British values, such as habeas corpus, the presumption of innocence, the right to a fair trial, right to protection from torture, are effectively abolished. So, I mean, I called this first slide after a sort of Daily Mail campaign. I don't normally do that, of course. So the 2003 Extradition Treaty, it was something that was in the headline news quite very often. That was one of the high-profile cases, but there were many others, and some of them have been forgotten about since. But yeah, this was front page and headline news in 2012, and for many long years. So Gary McKinnon, the hacker, who Theresa May saved and was greeted as a liberal hero who suffer from the same sort of medical diagnosis and life risk as my brother. The penetration of US jurisdiction into like another sovereign nation state or territory. And when we think about what the basis of the state is, which is presumptuously to like protect your own citizens, I mean that's why it exists. So I mean the way I'm going to explore race in this presentation and in is not so much through stereotypes and bad names and many things like that, but a conception of racism where the state withdraws its basic right of protecting its own citizens. So Dalal and Baba Ahmed, who were the two high-profile Muslim prisoners, the basis of their campaign is a very simple one, which is that if I've done anything wrong, put me on trial in my own country, I've never set foot in the United States, all the witnesses here, all the evidence is here. What would all normally be normal, logical, common sense? Despite 150,000 signatures for Baba Ahmed, which was one of the landmark Muslim political mobilisation, one of the landmarks in terms of sort of racial political engagement, and also built the foundations for things like the Shaka Armour campaign, and to such extent that the internal police record said Baba Ahmed had the same status as Stephen Lawrence in the Muslim community. And a bit more background, where you see the murky aspects with the Crown Prosecution Service and the Home Secretary. So Baba was subject to a gratuitous violent assault, and which resulted in £60,000 of compensation. The 4 police officers in charge had 61 independent complaints of violent assault from predominantly black and Asian men, and yet were never charged with anything and actually won their criminal case. And there's all sorts of murky things happening in terms of basic due process and why weren't they prosecuted in the UK whilst they were here. And as people ask, the basic indictment was Dala was accused of being an associate of a website called Ahsan Kulkaz, which ran from 1970 to 2002, so it was obsolete and offline 4 years at the time of his arrest anyway, which is predominantly 98% about the Bosnian genocide and the Chechen civil war, the second Chechen war of independence with Russia, and also had posts on Afghanistan, Iraq, Palestine and other things. And it's not something either Dala was either, like, according to the US government statement of facts, he's not something he even edited, typed anything or proofread or anything. And one of these servers was in the US for 8 months, so let's go through technicalities. And I've talked about, so British Justice for British Citizens was the basic slogan of the campaign, and some of the Daily Mail used as well, and just basically saying, what's wrong with British courts. The Daily Mail referred to Dala, my brother, as other unwanted guests. These are British-born citizens. So there's a notion of inequality of citizenship and precariety of citizenship. And I don't think it's just something happening in Britain. So to provide you with some other examples, Omar Kader, who's just been recently released, who was held in Guantanamo Bay as a 15-year-old child. His own government in Canada didn't protect him, and it's the same climate of Islamophobia and in the Western states, and the absurdity that you do not rescue a 15-year-old child from Guantanamo Bay and let him live there. Other examples would be Mohammed Sultan, who was a hunger striker, had a hunger striker in Egypt at the time of Sisi emergency. Again, he was a very pro-Obama, pro-Democrat guy. His own government didn't intervene. And another British example, recent example, Dr. Abbas Khan, who was a doctor in Syria, who was killed in Syrian custody. Similarly, you'll hear a sister say on radio, because he was a Muslim, the British government didn't provide him with the same level of protection, diplomacy, and pressure that they would have had if he had been a white British citizen. And so I'm going to start talking about poetry in a minute, don't worry. What happened to my brother, I see as a red light warning of what worse things to come. Theresa May only gets even more evil. So we actually have precarious citizenship. So we have citizenship stripping in Britain, It's something that even the US Supreme Court rejects, which sees as a sort of punishment or barrack. So you've had rendition and torture and drone murder of British Muslim citizens. Almost all the citizenship stripping, apart from one, which is a Russian spy, has been with British Muslims. And the most famous example is Mahdi Hashi, the Somali care worker, who's just recently been sentenced, not yet, but he had his citizen stripped while being rendition drone. So anyway, poetry. So Dala's campaign, it starts in 2006, so at the time of his arrest, and it's very traumatising for our family. And it starts with petitions and like community meetings. They've really come to be revitalised in 2011, where Dala decides he wants to like put up, kick up a fight and try his best. And the novelist A.L. Kennedy, who many of you might know, launches his prison poetry pamphlet, which is here and sells for just £2 for the bookshop there. And she launches it in Edinburgh in 2011. And there's a very heroic mother of five called Zaireen Taj, who's one of the unsung heroes of the campaign, who kept in correspondence with my brother over a number of years. And I cannot emphasise the importance of writing to prisoners, and produced this booklet, which is somewhere between a poetry pamphlet, a political tract and a zine, and also operates and fluidly goes through all those worlds. And I used to stalk every celebrity from Angela Davis to Doreen Lawrence, trying to get them to help my mother at some point. Yeah, it's better. Yeah, and so she also keeps a chronicle of her correspondence with him in The Guardian at the time. So she's doing a blog on creative writing. The very first thing she writes in 2011 is a book article called Different Types of Sentence, which you can easily find online. And the list of the book on writing, which is her writing and creative writing, sort of gathers them all together as an anthology. That article in particular, Solitary Confinement, is no place for a poet, it's particularly beautiful. So I guess this session's about performativity. When we requested to be recognised as a British citizen, because we believed in British justice for British citizens, we had this sort of performativity of like Britishness. So we had these. This is part of the our graphics and campaign work. And if you were here yesterday, my brother read his love poem to Theresa May shortly before being extradited. And so, I think there's a general conversation about performance, and as someone from a Muslim background who was Asian, who grew up in Tooting, who is interested in activism, I was expected to be interested into performance poetry and other forms of extra supremacist art forms. But you get this sort of derogatory talk from the sort of white literary establishment. You also get it from the performance poet who go like, yeah, I don't read Keats, I do it for the people who struggle. But my brother is always reading Keats in a maximum security prison. And so a lot of the poetry that I was writing at the time, it's actually playing on and subverting traditional forms. So he starts with the Sestina, where he does this poem called Extradition, which you can find online as part of the structure part of the film. He translates this 10th century Syrian Arabic poem into iambic pentameter. He tries to read all of Shakespeare and Belmarsh and tries to learn Latin in solitary confinement. I had to put up with this as his younger brother. These campaigns were very, very large. This was the picture on the right. That's the day of his extradition, and there was just a sort of variety of people sort of gathered together. And although we didn't stop the extradition, of course, and that's Theresa May. At the Conservative Party conference that year, the very first thing Theresa May said was, wasn't it great to say goodbye in relation to my brother in solitary confinement? So the campaign very much integrated itself in a number of existing movements. That is Jeremy Corbyn there, and I'm surprised that hasn't been a Daily Mail headline yet. He's going to be a thorough supporter of our campaign. So the sites in which I read Dala's poetry was very much outdoors. I did used to turn up at the Poetry Cafe and become an open mic poet and Keats House and other places, but it was actually more effective doing this sort of outdoor, being part of the general protest movement in Britain. So this is an Afghan war memorial for 11 years of occupation of Afghanistan, and I read a poem that Dana wrote about the consequences of bombing Afghan families. I might play a video if I have enough time. Oh dear. And just the type of people he'd read. So Dana's presence was very much kept alive within Britain. Another of the people who read his poems was artist taxi driver, who you might know through YouTube. People like Michael Rosen would read his poems at Love Music, Hate Racism, Jackie Kay, Avis Marvin, just many people would read it in parts of their set. So he had this live presence whilst being in a different country. And very tragically, he won the Koestler Prize on the year of his extradition, the Platinum Koestler Prize, so the highest prize for a writer in prison. And so his poems were projected on the Royal Festival Hall whilst he was in solitary confinement in the United States. And not just the anti-imperialist movement, but also the anti-austerity movement as well. So I would speak at things like People's Assembly, and not just because it's all run by the same SWP front groups or whatever, but like, really, when the government invokes demonising Muslims, whether even if it's someone like Abu Qatada or like Abu Hamza, the first thing you hear is their legal aid bill. Or when Bob Ahmed returned home, the first thing you heard was how much money he got on benefits. So when the government wants to attack the welfare state, when it wants to attack your rights, it's always invoked, these demonising terrorist Islamic figures. So you always know like how much the sort of, even though Gareth Pearce, who represented my brother, who's a contemporary hero, did a lot of work pro bono anyway and went out of the way, there'd always be like the figure in the Daily Mail how much your legal aid bill was over. But if they didn't detain them without trial for so long, it wouldn't be so much. So, internationally though, we also had, I'd just like to say it's just absolutely wonderful news to see Albert Woodfox free after 40 years of solitary confinement. It's very much integrated into the global movement against solitary confinement. And the Angola Free came on board to support us as one of the social movements against, and I don't believe in liberal NGOs. I don't believe just the law will save you. Slavery and apartheid were legal institutions, so we made a landmark challenge to the use of long-term isolation within US prisons, which is one of the last forms of legalised torture, something the United Nations Special Rapporteur on Torture wants to abolish, and something where 50% of the suicides in US prisons occur in solitary confinement. And the European Court of Human Rights rejected our appeal, and also whilst colluding with the US Supreme Court. So when the law fails, you have social movements. So the Angola Free campaign came on board and helped us. I did many meetings with Robert King, who's one of the free members of that Angola Free. For those not familiar with Angola Free, they were kept in solitary confinement for over 40 years for the, whilst remaining innocent, for the alleged murder of a prison guard, but really because they were organising Black Panther wings within prison. I actually want to play and this is from World Torture Day, World Torture Day. I wanted, and that's from a video which you can find online. So I want to play that clip, if you can, if it's possible. The one
down there.
Yeah.
I guess.
Can you cut and paste it? So this is going to be a 2-minute clip from the late great Herman Wallace. Herman Wallace spent over 40 years in solitary confinement, and when he was free, you might be able to just find it through Google. When he was free, he actually, 2 days after he was free, he actually died rather tragically. And it's important when we look at the war on terror that we see it as the longer war on terror. So the earliest wars on terror wars for white supremacy were the war on drugs and the war on black liberation movements, where every precedent finds its thing. So COINTELPRO provides the ground map for where they were simultaneously trying to destroy the rights of self-determination for people of colour, indigenous people. So as much as we remember people like Shaka Amar and campaigns like Our Brothers, we have to put them into a context of people like Leonard Peltier, who's been in prison for 43 years, people like Oscar Lopez Rivera, Puerto Rican independence, and people who fought against apartheid whilst it happened within the United States. Is it working? Yeah, can you just play that? So this is Herman Wallace reading one of prison poems from solitary confinement from a phone.
I was in a dungeon at the time when I wrote it, and I just decided to write something about myself and the things, the changes that I was going through and how I got where I am. Somebody said it was a poem. I said, you gotta be kidding me, it's a statement. Then when I got locked up through it and all of this, it just took off. They removed my whistle from general population to maximum security. I gained a voice. They removed my voice from maximum security to administrative segregation. My voice gave hope. They removed my voice from administrative segregation to solitary confinement. My voice became vibration for unity. They removed my voice from solitary confinement to the supermax of Camp J. And now they wish to destroy me. The louder my voice, the deeper they bury me. I say it, the louder my voice, the deeper they bury me. Free all political prisoners, the wall, political consciousness, common fathers, Anglo free. The title of this poem is a defined voice. If death is the realm of freedom, then through death I escape to freedom, which is a quote by Franz Fanon.
Okay, thank you. So I just think we should owe it people like Herman Wallace to ensure long-term solitary confinement is abolished in our lifetimes. Albert Woodfox has just joined our social movement and will be part of the movement to end long-term solitary confinement. Next slide. There's a really good film of Samuel L. Jackson about the Anglo Free. What was it called again? It was called, there is a really good film about Anglo Free response that you'd be able to see if you're not familiar with the case. There is sort of a lot of anthologizing of these earlier political prisoners. So the book on the left is by Ray-Luc Levasseur, who was from the United Freedom Front. These are sort of anthologizing. It's also got an introduction by Assatus Chakor, there's much sort of anthologizing this sort of earlier generation of the earlier sort of wars on terror and imperialism, and it's quite recent that so when we see prisoners like Guantanamo Bay and Abu Ghraib, you have to remember that they develop as exporting what occurs in the domestic US supermax prison. So every procedure from like force feeding, forced cell extraction, long-term solitary confinement was developed, against black people essentially in the criminal population, and then was exported to sort of your Muslim male, we just have to remember that, and including some of the interrogation tactics and so forth by the police. And these were things that I would very casually hear where my brother would call me on the phone for his 15-minute conversations. So I said there's sort of a subgenre of solitary confinement literature. I mean, there's a lot of incarceration literature, and the best post-colonial writing is from prisoners, not from goldsmiths. From George Jackson to Tariq Mahana. Do read this book. I was going to read some of the poems in here, but I don't want to do a bad impression of Assatus Chakor. And the book on the left, which you can download, that's by one of my heroes. There should be a link at the back on free downloads. It's a survival guide for people in solitary confinement, written by former prisoners in solitary confinement. And it's by one of my heroes. He's called Bonnie Kness, who's a long-term prison activist from Newark in New Jersey, who looks a bit like Dolly Parton but has the soul of Angela Davis. She She's been working with people from the Black Liberation Army and people who've been in solitary confinement for 20 years and what she calls no-touch torture. She's one of the early ones my brother supports. I'm going to read a very short poem from here. So this poem is from the Pelican Bay in... how much time have we got left? Okay, it's from Pelican Bay. I don't know if people are familiar with Pelican Bay, but a couple of years ago there was the largest hunger strike in probably history of 30,000 prisoners in the state of California, which is organised by the Short Corridor Collective, which are prisoners in solitary confinement. Again, not something that makes headlines or has commentators from your Owen Jones type people. And so, Pelican Bay is one of the worst prisons in the United States, and you have the SHU unit, which basically puts people into long-term punitive solitary confinement with no light or window for things called gang validation. And gang validation is basically a racialized way of torturing people. And it's so bad that there's a journalist called Shane Bauer, and he was held in solitary confinement in Iran, and then he went to California and said that nothing in Iran was as bad as the SHU units in California. And so this is a poem from this anthology. I gave it to my brother when he got into solitary, and I used to meet so many people who survived that system and ask how they survived. And I just want to emphasise, not all prisoner poetry is good on literary merits, but there's something else that comes out of it. A lot of prisoner poetry is actually quite cliched and prosaic, but I get something from this. So this is poem's called Survival, what survival is. So, survival is being spiritually and mentally filled by the angels of justice, fighting the fight for our liberation from Pelican Bay SHU. Survival is possessing the intellect to know when the psych comes in the housing unit to ask the mentally unstable if they need a psych line. And you realise how ridiculous it sounds. You're surviving. Survival is waking up in the morning in a sound mind, realising that one was not killed during the night or moved to some unknown destination. Survival is hearing one's neighbour laughing out loud because his son or daughter received a good grade in school or a great report card. Survival is when one can assist his neighbour in his time of need, no matter what his racial, political, or cultural views may be. Survival is hearing one's neighbour call out to make sure the man is not taking advantage of one and let the man know you're not alone. Survival is being able to state to yourself that I've made it through another day without being killed, beaten half to death, or made to stand in the shower, or hold in cell naked, handcuffed for hours for not moving fast enough, or having the wrong look, not using the right words, or speaking out on injustices. Having one's dignity at the end of the day is still intact to fight another day. And giving thanks to whatever God one might believe in before closing one's eyes for sleep. You smile because you have survived another day at Pelican Bay. So that was by one of the people in these very punitive SHU units. And do download the whole anthology, it's amazing. Oh, sorry, I have to... So there's many... Well, how much time I have? Oh, okay. So I was just saying, yeah, you have things like the haiku book. Put your life at bare minimum in solitary confinement. This is a next slide, please. There's a movement called No Separate Justice in New York, and basically, the idea in Guantanamo Bay is like people without trial, the people receiving trials under the Patriot Act and things like material support and plea bargains is not fair. So these are number names which you should memorise, and they gather. Next slide. And they gather, this is me reading outside Metropolitan Correctional Centre in New York, which is in Manhattan, and which, that's a person from Dartmouth. This is these are the sites in which Dallas poetry was read. So this is, Metropolitan Correctional Centre in New York is, Joshua Drayton said it's worse than Guantanamo Bay, but it's where many British have been renditioned or extradited to. Next slide. So this was the homecoming rally. So we had this, so next slide. So we read Dala's poems. That's Sheila Coleman from the Hillsborough Justice Campaign. I do think we should look more at things like Hillsborough to understand contemporary Islamophobia and contemporary racism. That's Theresa May. So yeah, this is sites in which we are reading love poems to Theresa May. The next slide, please. So Dala's, he's alive, he's home. He read yesterday. So Dala's poem still has this solidarity flex. So, these are two events. So there's Reclaim Diwali, which was a against the rise of the BJP, Hindu fascism, ultranationalism in the United States. So Thala read the poem that he read yesterday, which was called I Abastani, which is loosely based on one-tone partition violence, and imagines a state with no borders and stuff. And he was reading stuff like that at the Reclaimed Diwali, and he he also wrote a poem about the war crimes and use of rape camps by Serbian forces in Bosnia, which was banned by prison for a while. And he read that at the attempt to I can't emphasise the importance of remembering the Bosnian genocide, because I think much of contemporary Islamophobia springs from that. And for example, the Andrei Breivik massacre in Norway was entirely inspired by what happened in Bosnia, and if you go to his manifesto, you see the word Bosnia over 300 times. Things like Golden Dawn, Le Pen, even our own EDL have a link directly to that movement. And I think we also need to go beyond white liberal notions of NGOs. So people support Shaka Ahmed, but they don't really understand why he was in Bosnia. So we need to insert that narrative of the Muslim male in the 90s and how he responded to genocide in Chechnya and Bosnia and what that became as part of our story. And we haven't mentioned things like Islamophobia or the particular notion of anti-Muslim racism, but just to wrap up, so I don't think Salman Rushdie's Satanic Verses is the point in which a Muslim political mobilisation splits from the black one. I do think it's Bosnia, Bosnian genocide. That's not particularly... so just to conclude, there were so many different bridges of different groups and people and faith groups and in Thala's campaign, so the ultimate aim is to sort of make that sort of live into sort of some sort of so politics of solidarity win over the politics of fear and prejudice. Thank you.
Just whenever you're ready.
I just want to say thank you to everybody for this. This has been a really wonderful day so far. Okay, so this is a much smaller size moment of attention. It's mostly focusing on art practice, and particularly my own practice of memorization, but also sort of linkages from that. But mostly I think it really just is about that small moment of attention of reading a poem and memorizing a poem. So basically the way I'm going to do this is I'm going to read out what I have here, and then at the end I'll just sort of talk extemporaneously. Maybe to give you guys a little bit of the feeling of what it's like to be talked to rather than read to. And I think that's part of what we're trying to do when we memorize our poems. But I'm not going to memorize it. So, to begin with an anecdote, I attended a reading of Kai Miller's at Holloway, where he was reading from his collection, The Cartographer Tries to Map a Way to Zion. And his reading was very good, so I asked a question that was quite natural to me, namely if he was memorizing his work. The response I got was quite telling, I think, and I'm paraphrasing massively here, so please ask Kai for the specifics. But he said he did memorize his work at times, but he had to make sure to hold the book in his hand to give certain people a sense that he was reading it from the book. And this moment, which I'm sure he was quite conscious of, I want to pose here, is one of the location of authority. What is the body's authority over the text, and what is the text role in authenticating the body? Where might others assume authority or authorship lives? And where is race in this? And I'll suggest in this case, it's not merely perceived in the body of the poet or the words of the poetry, but has implications for the practices of memorization themselves. And although this isn't what I'm driving at, and this is maybe the only time I'll mention it, and I think it's come up earlier as well, there's perhaps also this racial anxiety around memorization, in which too much of it might signify improvisation, orality, something that's insufficiently literary, or spoken word, popular, non-modernist, etc., which I think we saw in Hannah's talk. But I've also seen that the audience won't buy the book unless you... Yeah, so I also want to say something just briefly on a philosophical note that's important to my talk, which is that I don't believe in literary community as something that can be ethically and politically coherent, and as such I doubt its existence, not as on a descriptive level, but on the level of the concept. The role of institutions within our production, including ones we create ourselves and may even actively embrace, such as magazines and journals, as well as ones that we might be more critical of, such as university programs, needs to be a part of our actively avowed intellectual history before we can even consider the question of what we're doing, much less whether we are doing it ethically. That the ethical can emerge without challenging capitalism is a fantasy framed entirely by our, perhaps partially fantasized as well, class position as intellectuals. In other words, my position is that we must understand ourselves as a class and perhaps, as multiple intersecting things before we can understand ourselves as a community. And fundamentally speaking, I don't think that it's coherent to insist that our presence within academia is an entirely good faith in the Sartrean sense, and I don't come to my talk today with an ethical intention. Perhaps to clarify, that's slightly different than saying that I come here with an actively unethical intention. I come here to learn and participate in intellectual life, albeit slightly damaged, to use Adorno's phrase. As Adolf Reed Jr. describes the liberation struggles of the mid-20th century, produced a managerial class of spokespeople, what used to be called race men, whose interests were implicitly thought to be representative of the masses. And to quote him, this race politics is not an alternative to class politics, it is a class politics, the politics of the left wing of neoliberalism. It is the expression and active agency of a political order and moral economy in which capitalist market forces are treated as unassailable nature. So all of this informs my decision to cite and perhaps actively emphasize the role that Roger Banneragard has played in my poetry practice. I feel obligated to note that Roger has been a problematic presence for the poetry community, big quotes, in recent years, and that a short Google of him will resolve these questions better than I could, but for this talk I will focus entirely on his poetic contributions, in particular his theorization of embodiment, and any criticisms of Roger's work, rather than criticisms of his personal actions, which are not mine to address, have rested on dubious claims that foregrounding his poetry will grant him as a man more power and legitimacy in literary spaces. I do not recognize this as a meaningful ethical claim. On the personal level, I do not wish to curate my associates or my reading list in order to create a utopia, even if it were possible. My personal version of feminism is a feminism that emphasizes desire, presencing, and recognizing the lack within the other. And I also think that Roger's work is significant and significantly underread, and as I understand my own practice to be in some aspects an extension of his, I think it may be slightly more obvious why I've had to give this perhaps overly long forward. So, I want to address quite specifically as well what bearing this may have on the question of race, poetry, and poetics in the UK, but in reverse order. So I'm going to address national and geographic origins first, poetics second, and then I'll open it up to ask what a memorization practice might have to teach us about race. Thus, my practice of memorization came to me in America as part of the Volume Young Writers Project in Ann Arbor, Michigan, which is my hometown. Founded by Jeff Cass, and whose faculty included, among others, the Trinidadian poet Roger Banneragard, who relocated to the US from Trinidad in the late 80s. He's been back to Trinidad repeatedly during that time. To look at one very American framing of this line of work, we can see the 2015 anthology, The Breakbeat Poets, which I think Hannah mentioned something about breakbeat poetics in her abstract, which focuses on largely American writers, largely of color, through a black arts heritage and hip-hop generation, and includes Roger's work. And one of the editors, Kevin Coble, was a faculty member at Volume in Ann Arbor for over a decade. And another editor is Nate Marshall, who's a student at Volume as well. So this, while on first glance we could see the work of memorization as an unproblematic extension of black arts orality, or a form of hip-hop or spoken word practice, and certainly we were encouraged to think of that in that way in America, right? To reason this way becomes slightly circular because it was a second wave of poets, largely black, who brought memorization and spoken word performance into being, and Roger's one of those poets. So we might see this hip-hop origin story as a means of simplifying and consolidating institutional history to make it seem more accessible, because hip-hop now is quite, it's a lifeblood now. For everything, including advertising art, it's just very, very widely touched upon. Or from the necessity of finding local ancestors or common touchstones that are explicitly American. However, we can find origins of this practice in Trinidad, and it's not difficult. We can look to Derek Walcott, who had his students memorize Milton and who received a colonial education. So the standard feature of colonial education, its fantasy, was of the colonies as integrated into the metropole, in a sense, erasing local names, places, and histories. And the Grenadian poet Merle Collins describes this education in her poem the lesson where she talks about how she can name all of the children of different kings and stuff like that, but she doesn't know any of the local spaces. So this emphasis on what is memorized can be seen as a holdover from the Victorian era, a temporal lag, and furthermore, the memorization of important English poetry carries with it these Victorian ideals of education as a civilizing procedure and a form of self-mastery. However, it was also taken up quite seriously by Derek Walcott and others. And in an interview, Walcott says that minimal withdrawing, taciturn kind of composition, and he's referring to American poets who do this, begins to wither memory. In a sense, when one reads a poem out loud, one is first of all presenting a poem to an audience, and secondly, one is also asking them to memorize it. So what's quite interesting is the tension between memorization in its original sense, as a neutral instrument, a white instrument, an instrument of colonial education, perhaps a form of civilization, and a replication of an oral practice used within Britain, and then memorization's contact point, which is the strangeness of the words of authority as they arrive and are themselves articulated by colonial subjects, subjects of color. We might view these unintended consequences of colonial education through Homi Bhabha's concept of sly civility, the way in which the colonial apparatus undermines itself in performing its own mission by producing subjects of color fluent in the discourse of power. To add a brief aside to Bhabha's concept, I think we could see an interesting counter-movement in something like hip-hop's popularity among a white audience, and I wrote my undergraduate work on the use of N-word among different racial groups. The ways in which a counterculture becomes vocalized, passes from body to body, from one racial group to another, and inflects itself differently, which Judith Butler discusses through the idea of the signifying chain, performativity, and iteration, and which she believes is a potentially politically productive process because it can dislodge some of these original kind of associations over time. So I find that many analyses of both these practices of passing the voice end up assuming that the person of color is worse off or voiceless. In the first case, through the imposition of white language, and in the second case, through the appropriation of dialect. And that in both cases, the sense of language as originary, and even as property, is emphasized in some kind of vulgar Marxist idea of expropriation of raw materials or linguistic labor. However, property is precisely what language is not. Indeed, what Bhabha and Butler emphasize, although differently, is language's presence in the intersubjective encounter, its mobility and the inevitable production of what we might call hybridity, performativity, or contradiction, in the way that language penetrates the subject, or even, as Zizek suggests, tortures the subject. And perhaps one reason that these intercultural linguistic encounters are often read through the idea of a foreign voice, a stranger in the body, is that this is precisely what we could consider all language to be. Language is fundamentally and definitively not ours, but another's in our body. As well as for Bhabha, the discourse taken in by colonial subjects in sly civility does not have to be an exclusively verbal one. And in fact, in Gully, the practice that primarily represents this reuse of colonial education for the purposes of the colonized, this aggressive fluency, is the game of cricket. So one particular site of emphasis that Roger contributed to my practice is the idea that the poem must become part of the body. And this gives rise to the use of many bodily metaphors within Gully, which is the book, which prefigure or come to explicitly participate in poesis. I won't go through them all here, but there are many. So one example he uses is davening, so this Jewish prayer where you sort of move about. But cricket is probably the primary kind of physical practice that he uses to figure poesis. And I'm just going to read a small selection from the foreword by Kwame Dawes about the significance of cricket. We should understand that these were no ordinary teams and that the sport was not simply a sport. This was the sport brought to the West Indies by British colonizers. One of the pillars of the English cricket establishment, Sir Pelham Warner, himself Trinidadian born and a positive influence on West Indian cricket, came from a family that had been one of the earliest and longest lasting owners of slaves. Throughout the 20th century, the subtext of world cricket was the dynamic of empire and the gradual collapse of the dominance of the British in the world. In the 30s and 40s, the West Indies had lived with the insult of being ridiculed as they competed with the dominant British and Australians. When they started to win in the late 50s and 60s, island after island was winning independence from the British. In the minds of many of us, the two things were not unconnected. However, the brilliant and unprecedented dominance of the West Indies cricket teams is read through Roger largely autobiographically through his own lived experience of playing the game and of spectatorship. And this distinguishes him from perhaps like Brathwaite's similar writing on cricket in Rites of Passage, or something we might think of as maybe slightly more canonical cricket writing or West Indian cricket writing, if that's like a thing. While it's not unusual for writers to engage in some form of physical practice, the sense of this practice as a discipline with impacts on poiesis is significant. As Hamja states further, when you play cricket, you're working out what your body is going to do and how well it will do it. So the sense of temporality, habituality, and activation in the present through memorization in sports is something we can see quite visibly and crucially within performance as well. In America, my teacher Jeff Cass also worked with this kind of memorization, kind of maybe inspired by Gully, and he wrote a collection called Wrestle the Great Fear, a performance poetica, where he combined physical practice of wrestling with the development of his own capacities as a writer and teacher. So primarily what I want to do is describe this practice, its implications, its beliefs, and my experiences of it, and what it does to a text, the contributions that memorization brings. The reason I want to emphasize memorization specifically is that I want to differentiate it here, although not fully, from improvisational practices like freestyling or oral storytelling practices you can see that Walter Owen describes as kind of purely oral practices. It's not really an oral practice, it's a practice of taking in the text, and I sort of said eating the text. Why I want to focus on this process of eating the art piece and what it might have to do with embodiment is to think about the othering of the self through memorization, and what you must essentially do in such a process to ingest your own words is to other them and feel them as mere words. And this is how the poem becomes part of the body, in a sense, which I know is quite contradictory, but I want to say we were educated to do this, to put the poems in the body, to make them part of our bodies, and to view our bodies as both the origin point of our writing, but also as the repositories of our writing, sort of how this practice sort of starts in Britain, moves out, and comes back in. So this does, in a sense, make us reliant on and aware of our memory as part of the body as well. The text must be broken down to pass into the body. It must be transformed, and quite radically transformed. What happens in memorization is that the original beats of the work are quite changed from what might occur in a reading, where the primary encounter is always between oneself as a performer and the page, and so with me right now on the laptop. In memorization, the work is first made neutral, a sequence of information, and any attempt to encode a proper performance into memorization, I think, is an impediment to performance. The repetition of the action at this point will drain the performance of its lifeblood and its spontaneity. And the script must be repeated perhaps hundreds of times until it's gotten into the body as a set of instructions, and that's what I think it's interesting to think of it as a practice, like a sport practice. My own instruction here to my students is to feel their own belief encountering the work. We often have several other people read a poet's work back to them, trying to sort of strip them of what they think their voice is. And where might their belief or affect be hidden in scaffolding the words. So in a sense, it's a stripping procedure where you have to, parts where you're pushing the reading should be eliminated and you just get to the words. And the next step is to re-experience it as an incorporated entity, as ordinary speech, as a presented ready-made. We don't regard ourselves as the author any longer, if indeed we are the author, but rather as the speaker of the new text. Our vision of the author's vision no longer applies. We have ingested the poem, and now we speak with the poem's authority. What we do to the poem now is between us and the poem. And often I find the best performances push quite against this original intended vision at the time of writing. It's the strain that's felt as passion. The natural movement of two different processes, reading and speaking, that together produce this tension. And to me, it's interesting to think about this performance and memorization sort of removing or reworking the lines of the poem. So to close, I guess, to reapproach the question of race as an element in this process, I want to talk about ways in which this practice, which does have a sort of multiracial, multinational history, and which is an abstract procedure that can move from group to group, although it does have an operant existence in the lives of people of color, might activate what we think of as race. And the question is one of the paradoxical co-consolidating relationship between authenticity and performance. And when one's own articulation of race is always an open question and perhaps something that has to be constantly maintained and chosen in the face of different kinds of assimilation, self-articulation is something that we must sort of opt into and articulate ourselves. So thus the authentic and the performed self are not contradictory options, but they're mutual effects. Perhaps this is what we see within the paradox of the memorized poem as well. The poem that must be taken in, the poem that expresses the self in one's own body, but also alienates it. It's in this combination of self-othering that perhaps we could see what's been described as double consciousness, and we could see the articulation of one's own memorized material as a practice that can become double conscious. And so what does this have to do with community and solidarity? And if I don't believe in a quote-unquote literary community per se, what might I believe in as a communal possibility, you ask? The most crucial point I want to emphasize about memorization is its ability to bring the poet and the audience into contact with one another in the present moment, rather than the ostensible, always fantasized historical aura of the text, or what I'm doing exactly right now. When we read from a page, a screen, etc., the interaction we ask the audience to receive is that of ourselves with an object, ourselves as interacting with the words, which is interesting when intentional but can be deeply unexamined. When we take the time to master the words, to make them worthwhile to our labor, we activate the register of our empathy and our sense for others that allows us to better give the audience something it is capable of receiving. And I know that this is not always communication, and communication isn't always the goal. So the same text can be received wildly differently. My friend Gal Lieberzahn, an Israeli-American poet who also participated in the same writing programs, wrote of his poem, What It's Like to Be a White Guy with a Black Eye in Detroit, for those who don't know, and it's after Patricia Smith's poem, What It's Like to Be a Black Girl, for those who don't know, that the question of empathy becomes significant in distinguishing the poem between white and black audiences. So black audiences would respond to the violence of the poem as quite familiar. It's about him getting punched by a student when he worked in a largely black school in Detroit, and he's white. They experienced the poem as funny, a redescription of their perhaps latent everyday. And so the line that made them laugh was this: when the school kids stare at you, is it because part of you is black, or the rest of you isn't? And this was quite painful for white audiences who Gall noticed were not used to framing their everyday experiences on the level of race consciousness, and they were made to feel unsafe by the description of violence, and the idea of being felt as visible minorities for being white. So for them, the reaction was shocked silence. When I asked Gall how he thought about this practice of memorization, he said, the poem is music, the poet is the orchestra, the audience is the conductor. When you don't acknowledge this, what you're doing is recitation and not performance. So I thought I would speak a bit. I'm how are we in time? Pretty close, right? I'm just gonna like yeah. But I just thought I wanted to speak a little bit without staring at this, because it's important if I'm talking about it to sort of walk the walk. I think it's really, really important that one of the things that Roger emphasized and that Jeff also emphasized in terms of wrestling and cricket and all of this sort of physical activity. And I do want to say that it is kind of masculine in a way. And I don't think it has to be that way, it's just how it has been cast. Because I think I'm taking it up as well, and trying to think about how you can incorporate feminism into it. But learning a bodily practice has this ability to kind of re-invoke knowledge, but express it in quite a condensed form, in particular with people. And so putting in that time to sort of ingest the poem allows you then to communicate it to someone else with an empathy that really might not be present if you're sort of in your own head and experiencing the page and kind of trying to like wrestle through it, as I feel like I just had to. There's something that we can give if we are fully present in the moment of a practice that we know well. And I think that's very, very important for us as poets. I don't necessarily think that it's part of everybody's practice, but there's something quite crucial for me there about building solidarity with an audience. Which, when we think of literary community, and I guess this is one of the reasons why I'm skeptical about this idea of literary community, at least as we think of it, which is usually just as practitioners. One of the things that's quite important about cricket here is the way in which spectators became almost the crucial part, of kind of vocalizing the victory of these cricket teams. Brathwaite's poem is all about the experience of spectating and the experience of speaking into being of sort of a nation, and Roger does the same thing, they're sort of mimicking the cricket players. And I think that if we sort of forget that the audience is present in what we're doing, in our own practices, we lose out on the reality that spectatorship and listening and reading is kind of why it exists. So that's it. Yeah. Thanks.
I'll just start with timer so that I haven't actually written out the paper. I've made copious notes, which means that the thing is short or as long as it wishes to be. So I'm going to try and keep to a broadly 20-minute time frame. Right. So I wanted to talk today about Karen Bergvall's Drift. If you're not familiar with this, it's an extraordinary text that combines sort of a very rich poetics of migration and loss and movement. It has a very complicated relationship to multiple source texts, including The Seafarer, which is a 10th century Anglo-Saxon epic, as well as a human rights activism-based document of a boat full of 75 migrants from different African nations who were left to die despite being spotted by multiple NATO air vehicles and who were not offered sort of any form of assistance. So it's sort of this complicated poetics of loss and movement that I wanted to engage with today. Also by a sort of like way of apology, interestingly for a paper in which I want to talk about the orientation of bodies of colour. I've been very sick recently, so I'm feeling a bit dizzy and disoriented, so I apologise if there are all these weird slippages that I haven't quite accounted for. And I wanted to start by reading just the marginalia at the start of the text, which is due north following a medieval sea poem, a contemporary sea drift, an aircraft surveillance image, a forensic report, a runic sign. And to sort of work through the idea of pursuing this form of a political rune. So traditionally, at least based on, I'm not an expert of Bergvall by any means, but based on my reading of a lot of reviews and critical material available on Drift, is that the focus tends to predominantly be on the first half of the text, which is the Anglo-Saxon epic and the historical body of the seafarer and how it presents itself through different kinds of voicings and unvoicings. So I wanted to refocus the attention today on the second half and look at the bodies of migrants and the bodies of sort of particularly within the current political climate and new debates on the matter, the notion of the body of the refugee and what happens. So over the course of the paper, I hope to be able to exhume these bodies both from a sedimentation of political discourses surrounding immigration and safety and so on, but also from the very complex linguistic surfaces that we have within the poem itself. This collision of registers and vocabularies, this introduction of a tremendous degree of difficulty that allows you to pose political questions about comprehension, visibility, and so on. Something I find quite significant is that in an interview with Linda Kinnahan talks about how Bergvall's work produces what, and I quote, Marjorie Perloff has called hybrid work of complex assemblages. Bergvall strives to interrogate with Perloff terms issues of representation through unfixing stable uses of language, aiming to explore areas of the conceptual approaches to female and feminine representation, as well as the power structures within which these sexualities must function. Obviously, the question of gender is incredibly important to Bergvall's work, but today I also wanted to look at what happens when you have the destabilizing of the lyric eye through this very complicated text and what it does for actually producing a racialized poetics as well as a politics. And in doing so, I want to look at what Bergvall's notion of a poetics of resistance is and how we might use that to query certain notions of, say, empathy or the notion of stepping into someone's shoes or a sort of a, what I would think of as at least slightly simplistic notion of solidarity, so an unproblematic solidarity, for example, and to query and challenge these notions slightly. So I wanted to sort of look at how language performs these functions of as stratification of white iteration, therefore the white bodies that precedes the sort of the loss of bodies that is occurring within this text, and what we can do to recover some of them. I imagine this to broadly feature three sections, one on voices and voicing, the second on visibility and obviously invisibility, and finally on bodies and orientation. So to the first section, so the section on voices, I think it first started when I listened to Zoe Scalding talk about drift in a seminar paper she offered at Cambridge, where she talked about how drift uses technologies of echolocation. So, balancing of sounds in order to sort of locate oneself, particularly for a text as linguistically complex as this. This is something that we also find within the text itself, and I quote Bergvall says, "I work some of it out by sound association. By engaging with the source text in a loose homophonic call and response, I can both cut away from the less yielding aspects of the trans-historic contact and validate the strongly sound-led rules of the original," and so on. I'm very interested in this notion of call and response, not just because of what it does linguistically, but also politically, given that the boat that was left to die largely demonstrated a failure of this call and response, where multiple signals were sent out, both indexical as well as verbal and visual, and a very determined failure to respond to them in a disavowal of these forms of soundings. And I think to some extent the fact that this text invokes a very complex vocabulary, uses multiple languages, twists dialects, forces the reader to engage with incomprehension and incomprehensibility, is testament to this notion of a difficult sense, a difficult politics of voice emerging. In a lot of her work, Bergvall, and indeed many of her interviews, she's talked about how, to some extent, she has identified some processes of voicing with an identification for her own sense of politics, and particularly through a queering of language, and therefore why she then writes in English, and why a lot of her poetry, she has then moved to English, where she says, "I know that as a young gay woman I was being defined often negatively by others, and this means that processing language with pleasure for me became very connected to a necessary physical act of verbal distancing from home languages, and eventually physical migration." So this question of how language comes to be tied to questions of movement and migration becomes something very important to me. Politically speaking as well, the extent to which discourses surrounding acceptance of immigration or acceptance of refugees, acceptance of very vulnerable bodies, has been pinned back to acceptability of voices, so what you sound like, whether or not you have access to a certain language. So from a very personal point of view, I really, really detest airports, because I find, apart from everything else, I find this whole process of going through border control incredibly humiliating. But I found this very interesting. So there is this presumed hostility that you meet at the border, and then they see me, and I'm very petite, to say the least, and there is a softening of this dialectic. And then I start talking, and they say, "Oh, where do you study?" And I say, "Cambridge." And immediately the conversation is a lot friendlier than I see the conversations being with some other people. And I find this interesting, because somehow I speak in an acceptable voice, or I speak in a slightly, a desirable accent, or I do certain desirable things. But the idea that the rhetoric of whether or not you can accept a vulnerable body within the body of your nation state goes back to the question of what kind of voices one might be able to adopt. So Bergvall is very interested in this issue of testimony, of the poetic figure being able to provide almost this act of witnessing, of speaking on behalf of someone in order to right historical injustice. In another project of hers called, which is part of FIG, of a text called FIG, is a project, a multimedia installation called Say Parsley, which is this incredibly powerful document about the genocide of Creole Haitians in 1937 in the border of Dominican Republic, where tens of thousands of Creole Haitians were murdered because they could not roll the R, the Spanish-inflected R, in the word for parsley. This is being referred to as the politicization and the stigmatization of difference, but also just tracing it back to a very contemporary politics of what is an acceptable voice or an acceptable way of sounding within political contexts. I also think it's particularly important to consider texts like these, which bring in all of these different voices, very difficult and complicated voices from different positions of authority. I also consider the fact that experimental poetry of this sort is working against different sorts of political pressures on language. So, for instance, given that these individuals were attempting to escape sort of the Libyan civil war at the time, considering the fact that you're talking about regimes of censorship under Gaddafi, for instance, as well as neo-colonial narratives that are spun around the figure of the dangerous other, or these bodies who wish to infiltrate Europe, for instance, or very contemporary iterations such as this film poster that we've been seeing around about the siege of Benghazi. Very much sort of like, say, Western film directorial figures such as Eastwood and Moore and so on, who present these points of crisis very much as the West versus everyone else. We have to do this because we are protecting everyone else's human rights, therefore some human rights can be compromised, etc. Something I find significant about this is this idea of how, so David Kaufman in a review of Drift talks about how there is an exploration of hyphens and interstices and how this produces a poetics of loss in Drift. So I find this important particularly because of the way these fractures within the text, the breakages of words, the insertion of the very architectural structure of the hyphen, becomes both a spatial as well as a somatic construct, the space within which these deviant bodies might be absorbed, as well as these spatial connections that may be framed within different sort of political states, primarily sort of Western states versus everyone else that is attempting to infiltrate the West. So moving on then to the section of visibility, I think we're already doing quite terribly on time, so we'll see. Something that this text relies very, very heavily on is this idea of positioning a culture of super visibility, or almost this hyper visualization. So bearing in mind that this takes place in a world where surveillance or technologies of surveillance are an inescapable part of most people's lives, and the degree of authority that is vested on certain powers in order to perform said surveillance, but within the specific context of the Left to Die boat. The fact that NATO aircrafts on multiple occasions did spot the boat and then did nothing about it is very important. But with the fact that part of the question of visibility gets rendered into a question of, as we heard earlier today, of legibility and readability of bodies, and why the migrant body then becomes something whose readability you can disavow. So you look at the body, but you don't really see it because you don't want to see it. This text draws draws sort of part of its source material from an incredibly important project called Forensic Oceanography, a project run by Lorenzo Pisani and Charles Heller, who use various systems of, various records of data available from surveillance records to demonstrate that different aircrafts and fishing vessels had at multiple points of time over this 14-day voyage to death registered this boat but done nothing to help them. So the fact that this is a text that is poised between the slippage of categories, genres, languages, as well as unvoicings, for me is a way of attempting to understand how the figure of the deviant migrant body, the body of colour, the body of the politically inarticulate, the political abject, gets sort of moved around in this transaction that no one wants to ultimately carry through. Heller and Pisani talk about how the sea, the sea now becomes, the sea is now one that is, quote, simultaneously composed of matter and media, because it's not just the physical substance of the sea, but all of these different surveillance records that you can map onto the sea itself. I want to then reconsider the idea of these bodies themselves, these bodies that have been left afloat to die, as functions of pixelations, as functions of sort of thermic data, rather than as political individuals who you can sort of take up within your radar for a few moments and then just disavow. So the fact that there is a lack of political action that tells you that, you know, well, you can just let these people die. You don't have to consider them to be political subjects. You do not have to consider them to even be sort of basic human beings, but the fact that they are just another form of, they're another sort of conglomeration of pixels is something that needs to be considered. So we then talk about this atmosphere of an excess of visibility, so not just surveillance, but also, for instance, drone strikes and the way they map collateral, who are obviously human beings, but it sounds so much better if you can say collateral. So the distancing function that takes place in an era of hyper-visibility and an excess of visibility versus a disavowal of certain kinds of visibility. And what Pizzani and Heller then say they are doing is that instead of turning the gaze of the state towards deviant bodies attempting to infiltrate borderlands, they turn it against the state to show the violence that is existent within these transactions. So what I argue then is that in her exploration of these different modes of unseeing, what Bergvall is doing is producing almost this ethical impulse that one might draw from, say, a Benjaminian model of the optical unconscious. The idea that you have an image, but the excess that exists in the margins of the image, not just ideas that you have, that you may sort of unconsciously experience, but that you have forcibly repressed within the oculocentric logic of a Western white sovereign state, and why then it must be exhumed and recovered and brought back to the foreground. So finally then, on the question of bodies and their orientation in space. So I think it's very important to consider that, given that this text talks a lot about these historical figures, so you have the seafaring tradition, so not just the seafarer, the text of the seafarer itself, but just the tradition of that goes all the way back from, say, Homer and Ulysses, via Coleridge the Mariner, Hemingway, Pound, who rewrites the Seafarer, W.S. Graham, The Night Fishing, and so on. So you have this palimpsest of heroic bodies that are simultaneous, that are presented as the heroic body, but are necessarily then also white and Western and masculine. And therefore, given that these deviant bodies are emerging from out of this palimpsest, how is it that we can understand their engagement and their orientation within a very contested space? I found, so I was reading up a little bit more about Pound's seafarer figure. I found it interesting that many critics chose to talk about it as a crossing over of sea figure, which I think is very significant for a text like this, particularly given that it produces in multiple senses this notion of crossing over. So both the chiasmus of maritime routes, so the fact that these individuals were meant to set off on a particular route and then lose all the orienting devices and then cross over different routes, eventually getting lost. But also the intertwining of vocabularies and languages that we get within Bergvall. As well as much later, sort of in conclusion, when I talk about this, the idea of genetic crossing over and forensic traces that are left between systems of surveillance and systems of deviance. Karen Bergvall also mentions somewhere in the text that once crossed is always crossed. The idea that the point at which you set off from you set off from a space that can be marginalized or can be sort of repressed, and once you set off from that point, in a way there is no turning back. That your fate has been then determined by all of these different competing systems of power. So if we briefly consider, sort of say, the Deleuze and Guattari model, the maritime model, the idea of transposing semiotic maps upon the sea, so striating these surfaces, therefore making them more comprehensible within certain systems of knowledges, to sort of try and understand how these semiotic mappings then grid these particular bodies. And within the text we find, for example, that when all of these individuals, which don't just include adults but also multiple children and babies, are put in this boat with no food or water, just fuel and orienting devices, compasses, GPS devices, how they are reduced and rendered into purely orienting bodies rather than bodies that can hark back to a sense of either the bios or the Zoe. To sort of consider how the sea historically has been the site of competing sovereign powers. So the idea that you have sovereign claims over the sea. So and sort of also, I'm hesitant to call it within a very capitalist logic because obviously it predates capitalism in the sense that it is far more, I think, a white sovereign Anthropocene project, given that certain kinds of sea crossings have been seen as desirable and legitimate when you consider colonial crossings, for example, or the movements of slave ships. But when you have this perverse echo sort of bounding back, the migrant ship that is now crossing into your land suddenly is incredibly dangerous, while also simultaneously being very, very powerless. There is a lot of discussion, obviously, about how the sea, functions as this liminal space, and I think an obvious sort of critical route to go down is to think about harbour and how liminal spaces often become spaces where strategies of communal selfhood may be formed. And then I question here whether a text like this in fact challenges this notion of how the sea then becomes a space not just of liminality, but of a space where marginality gets turned into liminality. Because suddenly these bodies that you don't have to consider at all are now posing an active risk. So now you do have to consider them and then have to render them powerless. Something I found very affecting in the text was one of the records of sort of the first sightings of the NATO aircrafts from the boat, including the comment that we held up babies to show that we were not smugglers. So the idea of this indexical gesture of empathy, so you hold up a baby, but the fact that even that is obviously insufficient, so they do drop some packets of water and food but don't actually rescue anyone. And obviously it's trivially true that these indexical gestures will be the first to get absorbed within the sea. But I'm also reminded of how what contemporary engagements with this notion of holding up a baby, for example, is within immigration and refugee politics. So if you think of the figure of Elan Kurdi, and suddenly there is this wave of empathy that is briefly and conveniently raised because you've seen an image of one dead child without having to engage with histories of Western interventionism that have led to several hundred dead children, for example. But also, I don't know if you've seen this, but Charlie Hebdo satirized this recently, or at least allegedly satirized the media hysteria. I mean, it's so many levels of ironic satirizing at this point that one is never sure what the actual intent is. The media hysteria around discourses of radical empathy, where they had, the top panel had an image of a dead child, very clear reference to Kurdi. And then the next image said, what would he grow up to be? Would he grow up to be an arse groper? This is in the context of the Cologne attacks. Now, whether or not they were satirizing it is frankly something I don't really care about. But importantly, the fact that you can take up, bodies of color to the instrumental end of producing political satire, where you can take the image of the death of a brown or a black child to perpetuate these forms of critique against sovereignty and so on and so forth. Okay, I shall wrap up. So I think finally, I wanted to consider how a text like this might be helpful to try and understand bodies of colour within a very homonationalist framework. So the idea that sort of structures of power, particularly say white supremacist power, co-opt liberal political discourses such as queer rights or feminism, but only when you can explicitly position the dangerous, black or Muslim male other in order to invoke appeals to, for example, let us protect our women or let us protect queer individuals, and so on and so forth. But the idea that again, going back to the question of visibility and invisibility, that there is simultaneously, suddenly, a recognition that women are victims of structural sexual violence, while refusing to acknowledge the fact that sexual assault are often rife within refugee camps, or as a complete failure of white sovereign states intervening in any form, but also the way these discourses get co-opted. I had other things to say, but I'll stop there.
Okay, we got maybe let's take 10 minutes for questions. If anyone's got any questions, and then so Sophie and Andrea. Maybe wait a second for this movement.
Thank you for all three of those papers. And I probably am not going to formulate this right, but I hope it's going to produce some discussion or some answers. I was very struck by the phrase purely orienting bodies, and it struck me that it goes across quite a lot of the discussion that's happening today, that bodies of colour, non-dominant bodies are expected to be purely orienting in lots of ways. They're only expected to point to themselves and their own politics, or to point to particular kinds of national discourses, as you were talking about with your brother. And it struck me that in all three papers, it wasn't so much that you were disorienting those bodies as orienting yourselves alongside them. So you were talking about family relationship, a pedagogical relationship, and then you were talking very affectively about your relationship with Caroline's work. And in the book, in the third section of the book, it gets talked about even less. She talks about her relationship. She tries to think critically about her relationship as a migrant to these other bodies in movement, and as someone who is confronting queer politics around migration. So without wanting to say anything sort of really simplistic about, oh, it's so relational and intimacy, but it strikes me that that's a really strong rhetorical move in an academic setting, to talk about your relationship to the people that you're talking about. It's not a typical objective sort of academic move, and to what that might mean for the political and poetic movements around it. It's like not just to use the word ally very freely, but to think about what it means if we orient our bodies with these other bodies that are being supposed to be pure orienting bodies. I don't know if that makes any sense at all. Like as somewhere beyond solidarity, like to actually proclaim relationships and to the demands that those relationships make on us.
Should we take Andrea's question? That's that.
Two questions which are kind of combined. First, Srishti, I was interested in the way that there was a slight slippage from the notion of echolocation to call and response, and actually they're not identical. Echolocation to me is more like that situation of interpolation that you describe at the border. Call and response makes me think about particularly African American vernacular traditions, which are around congregation. So not bouncing your sound off a hard body, but a kind of dialogic mode of co-production of song. The second thing was that I thought that actually your two papers were linked, because Aimee, you're talking about memorization as a possible form of presence and radical empathy. Sorry, the voice started to go. There's of course another context for it, which is within prison literature, where memorization is incredibly important for holding on to poems which are written in conditions of the most oppressive censorship and which cannot be distributed. From Anna Akhmatova's poems being memorized, in Russia through to the poems in Guantanamo Bay, tens of thousands of lines of verse which can't go anywhere, so people have to memorize them in order to look towards a future. So there's a sense there not of presence, both bodily presence and temporal presence, but of a kind of orientation towards a future in which the poem might find new conditions for circulation.
Yeah, and I think it's the ultimate form of smuggling, right? To take it into the body. I mean, and writing, in a sense, is that with experience and with objects and with people, that we're taking it sort of in and trying to smuggle it, in a sense. I didn't really get to talk about that, but it is interesting. Nikki Finney, in her National Book Award speech, said something about how interesting it was in terms of being forbidden to read or write, and what it means, what it means is a kind of fugitive practice. So yeah, that's very, very important. I think we sort of rely on the idea that our environments will support us. If we're going to write something that kind of depends on a stable, let's say stable internet or a stable, whatever it is that we're using to produce our writing. But sometimes that, when you're stripped and when you're basically your body or yourself, that not only can make you more empathetic, but I mean it does sort of make you think about what you're capable of taking in, and what you're capable of incorporating into a bodily practice, which is actually quite a lot more than you would think. There's a lot of sort of systems of memorization and ways of taking things in.
Yeah, and that's certainly the practical reality. So when I was in Belmarsh and Larkin, like in forms of group isolation, you still had education classes, access to a library, you could call your family every day, and then transferred to Supermax. There was no library, your life is a slot through a door. There's frequent shakedowns, which means forced cell extraction, gassing out the cell, and very, very limited forms of, so everything was quite precarious. And you contact with family so little so you can even, so yeah, I've had some practical, so I suppose memorising and keeping the poem alive is that, being a hope or return home. Yeah, not something I thought about before. It's also, I think memorisation of like Quran and stuff as well has some huge significance for certainly prisons in the Tamil Bay and Supermax.
All I would say was, sorry, that was my fault bit, because I'm confusing. I didn't want to suggest that echolocation and call and response were the same thing. I wanted to say that my interest in sound and voices in Bergvall came from Zoe's seminar on echolocation, and I was interested in these questions of sort of call and response and communication and its failure in orientation in Bergvall. Sorry, that was my fault. And in terms of the question on sort of solidarity and orienting, I mean, I think I do want to sort of like put a bit of pressure on the term solidarity, because I sometimes feel that it allows for this compression, the simultaneous compression and dilation of distance, where you say, I feel really, really, really bad about this, therefore I don't need to do anything more. So I think, therefore, sort of just to try and see why, obviously the affective is incredibly important and a political tool, but to see how we might move out of that to doing something more than that.
Any more questions? Yes.
Aimee, I was interested in your presentation when you were talking about bodily practices that are kind of taking you out of conscious thinking. And you were saying something to the effect of when you memorize a poem, it allows you to be conscious in the moment rather than thinking about the language on the page and that kind of stuff. I just wondered, like in your own process, does that moment of like when the poem becomes a subconscious process, does that moment easily suggest itself to you? Do you realise when that moment happens? Is it something that's built into your writing life now, or is it like a separate process? You write the poem and then you spend a given period of time rehearsing, memorising, and all that kind of stuff.
This is interesting because I guess it goes back to what Walcott's saying about a good poem is one that we do memorise as well. So like it also interacts with my practice of memorising inadvertently or intentionally other people's writings. Because I don't know if anybody has the experience of being able to quote lines back to their friends who might be writers or something like that. But it does happen. You know, you hear a poem a few times, you've read it, and you have a line in there and you can say it back to someone. So I think, and then I guess also I've done some theatre as well. So I've had some experience in memorizing like someone else's script or someone else's text. But I think what's been very important to me is the sense of what you're doing in memorizing is sort of almost like pressing, almost like squeezing the juice out and flattening it. And there's sort of that first layer, I guess. And in the second layer, you actually feel the text disappearing, totally. And it's back here somewhere. And then you actually feel this moment of loss, I think, when you incorporate the text fully, because it's not there anymore and you can't see it. So like the loss of vision, like originally you're memorizing, you're seeing words and you can kind of say, okay, I'll go back to that, I'll go back to the third line, I'll go back to this, and then like at some point it's like, and like it's behind you and, or it's in you, and or it's not anywhere, and you don't kind of have a sense of the text anymore, you have a sense of speech, and it incorporates itself into something you're doing. But I think that's true with other practices as well. And there's a reason why I kind of keep returning to sport, because I think it's important, but also with math, I guess. There's things that you can do where it actually feels like it's disappearing once you learn it, like in a sense, like, and actually that, I guess that does create an immediacy of other things. And I think in terms of political organizing, this is what I might suggest, because I don't think anything I talk had anything to do with political organizing. The kind of presencing that I'm talking about is almost like, to some extent, a precondition for being aware enough to engage in sort of thoughtful, maybe organizing with people. I don't think organizing has to be thoughtful, it can just go. Sometimes you just need to do something, but it seems to me that the less we have kind of in front of us, between us, kind of getting in the way, whether that be, I don't know what, angles or, you know, whatever we're trying to focus on instead of kind of the contact and the building and the tactics, that can be, it's better to kind of put that behind us.
Is there any final burning points? Otherwise we could thank our speakers. And that's great.